Before I begin, I just want to state that this is my first time doing any type of video in this format. I hope to keep doing some in the future, preferably on larger texts, or I guess less dry texts. I don't really consider Kant too dry, but I know that many do. Regardless, I just wanted to say thank you to people who made some videos in a similar format in the past. It really helped inspire me to do this. For example, Jade Vine's videos on Martin Heidegger, as well as Ludwig Wittgenstein. But before I begin, I just wanted to state that this is about the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, which is a smaller text released by Immanuel Kant, who in the course of this video, I will not go too in-depth regarding his life or his history and such. I feel as though that might be more fitting for a video on one of his 3 critiques. But regardless, it is time to begin. Immanuel Kant's status is impossible to overlook. His 1781 magnum opus, The Critique of Pure Reason, is among one of the most impactful texts which redefine metaphysics and philosophy as a whole. Due to the length of this text and the consistent need for him to take a beyond detailed approach in the explanation of his project, it was easy for many readers to misunderstand his ideas. Luckily, 2 years later after the first edition of this critique, he released the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, or just the Prolegomena for short. Although it is thought to clear up his ideas and provide clarity to all readers, it's still very easy to see how this text can be misunderstood, so I felt that it would be helpful to create a comprehensive yet digestible uncovering of this text. Before we start though, I believe it will be helpful to provide both the outline of this project as well as some necessary terms to know for a deeper understanding. To begin, there will be many responses to past philosophers who dominated the sphere of thought in philosophy at the time. In order of who will be spoken about the most, it will be David Hume, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, René Descartes, George Berkeley, and lastly, there will be some slight responses to John Locke and Aristotle. I suppose some people could claim that Descartes was mentioned more than Leibniz, however, he responded to both pretty much equally. Before I clarify the main sections of this text, it is important to clarify that metaphysics and Kant's project as a whole are not only relevant and interesting to philosophy, but cognition and existence as a whole. The main sections of this text will be divided into preamble on the peculiarities of all metaphysical cognition, how is pure mathematics possible, how is pure natural science possible, how is metaphysics in general / as a science possible, and he wants to speak on the determination of the bounds of pure reason. Now, although this might seem, boring, the way of which he looks into this and connects it to human cognition and understanding is a masterpiece, and it really changed the way that we can view life and being in general. Quote, "We are discussing not the origin of experience, but what lies in experience. So this distinction allows us to separate empirical psychology and other physical sciences from a metaphysical system. What this is, we'll see soon. I'm unsure if this is contained in the very first editions, however, in the most common edition today, the Ellington translation of the second edition, there's also an appendix after the conclusion, but we're not going to go over that too heavily. It's essentially just an assortment of restated points and just additional criticisms towards Hume. To go over some terms that are very important to help understand this text, we will start with a priori and a posteriori. So a priori is knowledge that comes before or independent of experience, while a posteriori is knowledge that is only obtained through experience. So this is very crucial and will be probably one of the most important pieces that allows him to criticize Hume. And it is seen as one of the biggest flaws in philosophy prior to Kant, that people tried to group various a priori concepts as something that could be seen and experienced. Analytic and synthetic statements. So when presented with these examples, it may appear to relate to grammar and linguistics itself. However, as we will see this project unfold, this distinction is very essential for Kant. Analytic statements have the predicate already within the subject of the statement. An example of this would be all bachelors are unmarried, or a triangle has 3 sides. Just the word bachelor already implies it being unmarried. So the concept of being unmarried or having three sides is already contained in the subject of these sentences. Synthetic statements, on the other hand, depend on empirical observation and experience. Some bachelors wear suits, or some triangles are drawn with pencils, requires us to connect or synthesize the subject and the predicate to prove if it is true. For the last idea that is crucial for understanding this text, metaphysics. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that looks into existence and being as a whole. So it looks into the foundations of which we can lay questions and concepts on, the world, nature, possibilities, the relation between matter and mind. It basically looks into what there is and how it is. So Kant calls metaphysical knowledge lying beyond experience. Lastly, for those who have either not read the Critique of Pure Reason or do not intend to, although the Prolegomena does provide us a wonderfully clear look into Kant's metaphysics, jumping into it with no direction or understanding of his ideas will be rather difficult, as this text in itself reads like a response both to himself and many previous thinkers. To begin, the preface is essentially a summary of what he intends to unfold throughout the project, as well as some critiques against David Hume. The connection of cause and effect is one that Hume stated is entirely impossible to think a priori, and that a priori concepts cannot be thought of through reason. Kant's issue with this is essentially Hume stating that metaphysics is impossible to have any value. Quote, "This was Hume's problem. It was a question concerning the origin of the concept, not concerning its indispensability in use. Chisels and hammers may suffice to work a piece of wood, but for etching we require an etcher's needle. Thus, common sense and speculative understanding are both useful, but each in its own way. The former in judgments, which apply immediately to experience, the latter where we judge universally from mere concepts, as in metaphysics. When Kant tried to solve Hume's objection, he was not just able to solve it, but he also found that he was beginning to determine the whole sphere of pure reason and its boundaries." So in the preamble, we already see that we've covered the definition of metaphysics, and he also goes farther to distinguish the difference of analytic and synthetic judgments. Analytic judgments for Kant are always a priori, even when the concepts are empirical. For example, gold is a yellow metal. Well, gold has, being a yellow metal, already contained within the subject. And in regard to synthetic judgments, we see some very important divisions. So judgments of experience are always synthetic. A good example of this would be the sun warms the stone. So this is something that we can only see through experience and empirical means. Mathematical judgments are also always synthetic. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant spent a lot of time on this, but with one example it is really easy to provide clarity. 7 plus 5 equals 12. This appears to be analytic. However, in the concept of 7 plus 5, you will not discover 12. You need to use your own intuition to make this synthesis possible. So, again, a lot of these concepts seem as though they are related to linguistics, math, or just normal formal logic. However, we will see as he develops the system the relevance of these. So in section 4, Kant decides to ask the question, how is metaphysics at all possible? We know that it's possible as there are certain pure a priori synthetic cognitions that are certain and given. For example, pure mathematics. 7 plus 5 does need intuition to cognize 12, but its truth as a whole does not depend on us to confirm it. In section 5, Kant asks the question, how is cognition at all possible? So how is it possible that we can experience fleeting moments, the totality of moments, memories, basic human experience? Well, Kant says experience is nothing but a continual joining together or synthesis of perceptions. And this leads us to the next quote. Quote, "For how is it possible, says that acute man, that when a concept is given to me, I can go beyond it and connect with it another which is not contained in it, in such a manner as if the latter necessarily belonged to the former. Nothing but experience can furnish us with such connections. So before we begin the first section, I just want to go over this quote a bit as it's really important. Now we're starting to see the depth of his system. Things that we experience every day, such as cognition, being able to connect our past with our future or our present, and things of that nature, well, we never really ask the questions as to how that happens, or how it's possible that we can see a group of objects and see them not only as singular objects, but also as a community or totality of objects. We will, of course, go further in depth with this later, but now we are starting to see the depth of Kant's scheme. So Kant asking, how is pure mathematics possible in the first part, or I guess chapter? There's not really any differentiation of which it is. There's just a differentiation of the sections. So in section 6 to 7, as we have passed the preface, we are now starting to look into the details of his transcendental philosophy. So although we spoke about pure mathematics already, Kant raises two questions in this section that really help us better understand this text. How is it possible to intuit anything a priori, and how can the intuition of the object precede the object itself? Quote, an intuition is such a representation as would immediately depend on the presence of an object. Concepts, indeed, are such that we can easily form some of them a priori. Take, for instance, the concepts of quantity, of cause, etc. But even these require, in order to be meaningful and significant, certain concrete use, that is, an application to some intuition by which an object of them is given to us. So this quote is very important as it really lays the groundwork, or I guess the framework of what Kant's concepts are. So concepts such as quantity and cause are very important for our cognition. However, he's able to distinguish in the second part of this quote that that's only possible if it is needed or meaningful and significant, as he said. So for example, we can't really intuit an object in a form of appearance if that object is not within our cognition and understanding. If my intuition contains nothing but the form of sensibility, which in me as subject precedes all the actual impressions through which I am affected by objects. So, he's starting to lay down the difference of noumena and phenomena, or the world that lies beyond experience and the world of experience and sensibility. This distinction he'll heavily go into depth about later, and of course he does go into depth heavily in the Critique of Pure Reason, but just for right now, we're going to go and lay down the distinction. Noumena. So these are things that are unknowable to us as they exist independently of human perception. So we'll never be able to truly cognize things as they really are, as we are limited to the world of sensibility and the world of perception. This distinction right here, he's going to just keep on laying down and going further into depth about. But for right now, this quote might be pretty helpful. Quote, what can be more similar in every respect and in every part more alike to my hand and to my ear than their images in a mirror? I cannot put such a hand as a seen in the mirror in the place of its original. For if this is a right hand, then in the mirror it is a left one. These objects are not representations of things as they are in themselves. So this quote is very helpful, but it can also be slightly misleading, as it kind of makes it seem that the world of sensibility and such is entirely a facade that we can escape from. Kind of like how instead of seeing our right hand as our left in the mirror, we can just look down and see that it is our right. Making this distinction, though, does kind of elucidate how we do live in a world of appearances and representation. Phenomena. So phenomena are things that appear to our senses. It's basically what resides in the world of sensibility, how we can see things, perceive them, and such. So what Kant is saying here basically in this response is, if his intuition only contains sensibility and reference to experience, then it is impossible to ever cognize objects as things in themselves or noumena. We will only ever view objects in space and time as appearances. So for Kant, space and time are the pure intuitions that lay subjective conditions for experience as a whole. Part 2. How is pure natural science possible? Quote, nature is the existence of things, so far as it is determined to universal laws. Should nature signify the existence of things in themselves, or noumena, we could never cognize it, either a priori or a posteriori. So this is very important, as he is furthering the distinction between the world of things in themselves and the world of our sensibility. And this is a very important time to now look into Kant's Copernican revolution and the way of which this thought process was possible. The astronomer Nicholas Copernicus made the revolutionary astronomy claim that, as opposed to things orbiting around the Earth, the Sun is in the center of the orbit. This obviously changed the way of which we view our galaxy, and I guess space in general. So here, Kant does a very similar thing, and instead of saying that the world conforms to our understanding, he says, no, our understanding conforms to things in the world. So this is what allows us to cognize experience. This framework lays the ground for the idea of the world of noumena to exist and our world of experience to have a proper connection to our understanding. So the way of which we view things isn't really we are seeing things how they are and they get transmitted to our understanding, but rather our understanding is what deciphers what we can see in the first place. Section 16 to 18. So in section 16, Kant provides another meaning for the word nature. So in his first definition, it was just the existence of things so far as it is determined to universal laws. But now he goes on to say that it is also the totality of all experience. So in the first form, it only denoted that the conformity to law of the determination of the existence of things generally. So basically the fact that things exist and they conform to a law. Well, with combining both of these statements, then we are able to piece together the idea that the conformity to law of all the objects of experience, and so far as it is cognized a priori, their necessary conformity is what makes nature. So it's not just the fact that it conforms, but it's also the totality of what is all conforming. So, judgments. In section 19 and 20, Kant goes over judgments, which is the way that we can bring given cognitions into an objective unity of apperception, which is how Kant basically says self-consciousness. So in this division, he says that there's judgments of experience, which are empirical, such as the sun warms the stone, and then judgments of perception, which do not require pure understanding. That'd be like lemons are gross, or this room is warm. Things can only become judgments of experience if it is universally valid. These statements do not rest solely on perception, but rather the pure concept of understanding. This allows us to look back at Kant's critique of Hume's ideas on causality. So now we can see that in order to go from a judgment of perception into a judgment of experience, the concept of cause is very important for our intuition and the way of which it can be used for judging things. Section 21. The table of judgment and categories. So in the table of judgments, he says that they are nothing but propositions which subsume all perception under those pure concepts of the understanding. So we'll go a bit more in depth soon, specifically in section 24. He's just glossing over it here, but he's basically saying that the way of which we perceive things must first slightly be calculated through this table so we are able to properly perceive it. He goes much more in depth on this in the Critique of Pure Reason. However, we are able to see that things such as quantity, quality, modality, and relation are very crucial for the way of which you perceive things. But again, in section 24, we'll go a lot more in depth. Quote, experience consists of intuitions, which belong to the sensibility, and of judgments, which are entirely a work of the understanding. So Kant is starting to lay a slight overview, or rather just a hierarchy of what we have covered in the way of which we could perceive things. So we see that our understanding works through us needing to make judgments, and through this, we of course go through the table of judgments and categories and such, which allows us to enter the world of sensibility, intuit things, which then provides experience. Sections 22 to 23. Quote, the sum of the matter is this. The business of the senses is to intuit. That of the understanding is to think. But thinking is uniting representations in a consciousness. The uniting of representations in a consciousness is judgment. Thinking, therefore, is the same as judging or referring to representations to judgments in general. So this means that experience consists in the synthesis of appearances or perceptions in consciousness, however, only if it is necessary. So that means, of course, only if we perceive it. All of these principles within the system of nature which precedes empirical cognition, our ability to see things in the world, that is what answers how pure natural science is possible. Well, it is possible through the way of which we can experience this world, which of course is done through understanding, then judgments, then sensibility, then intuition, and then of course experience, which provides nature, which we've seen is the necessary conformity to these laws, as well as the totality of all experience. Sections 24 to 29. As we stated prior, space and time are necessary conditions for our cognition according to Kant. He really elucidates the tables presented back in section 21 and says that all of these depend on space and time to allow us to intuit appearances. But before we proceed back to the world of the noumena and phenomena, Kant, of course, goes briefly back to attacking Hume. Quote, now we are prepared to remove Hume's doubt. He justly maintains that we cannot comprehend by reason the possibility of causality, as we cannot comprehend how from the state of one thing an inference to the state of quite another thing beyond it, and vice versa, can be drawn, and how substances which have their own separate existence should depend upon one another necessarily. So, as he goes back into it, he's able to see that the ability to cognize singular objects as a group, separately, as a cause, or in relation to each other, is something that is not a mere learned illusion, like Hume says, but rather a priori principles. This is why judgments of experience are universally valid and recurring in the world. So, Hume basically is not able to develop how causality can properly be perceived, so he basically just passes it off as a commonsensical mere illusion. So, going back to noumena in sections 30 through 35, as we stated before, it is what is beyond objects of experience, and they have no meaning whatsoever that can be grasped by our understanding. Kant says, they serve, as it were, only to spell out appearances, so that we may be able to read them as experience. So it's really easy to misunderstand what Kant means here by things in themselves, as it's easy to see it as like some mythological realm that lies beyond us of things as they truly are and such, and we can grasp it, but no. Kant really clearly says it's something we can and will never perceive. It is easy to jump to the conclusion he's making a very easy hypothesis that is impossible to refute. But, for example, if I'm looking at an apple that I see as green, and my friend who is colorblind sees it as red, there's no way of truly distinguishing what it looks like beyond our eyes and understanding. This is a very surface-level example, but kind of goes alongside Kant's mirror example with his hand, that we'll never truly see things as they are in their purest form, outside of human sensibility and intuition. We can now make the distinction that all synthetic principles a priori, so pure mathematics, pure natural science and such, are nothing more than just principles of possible experience. Sections 36 to 38. In this section, Kant asks, how is nature itself possible? Well, he says it's only possible to be answered when you divide it into two questions. How is nature possible in general in the material sense? And how is nature possible in general in the formal sense, as the totality of the rules under which all appearances must come in order to be thought as connected in experience? So, the first one we can easily answer through what we see in the text, and that is appearances, or the world of phenomena. It is possible due to the fact that we cannot see things as they are in themselves, and we only see the appearances that we receive through our cognition, which we already kind of went over the hierarchy of that before. How is nature possible in general in the formal sense as the totality of rules? Well, that is slightly just an analytic a priori concept that we'll never truly be able to answer, at least with complete certainty. Due to the fact that it's analytic a priori, the way that we have gone through this system has been a bottom-up method. So we've started with our understanding or the world of which we live in, and we've kind of just gone back as far as we can. That is how we're able to see synthetic a priori claims, such as pure mathematics or pure natural science. However, we'll never be able to truly grasp things in the complete formal sense just through the fact that we get things through concepts, judgments, and the like. Part 3. How is metaphysics in general possible? At times, to fully understand a system, it is best to look for its limits and its boundaries, and this approach for Kant can be termed his Transcendental dialectic. So as we've seen thus far, Kant's method for going through the system has almost been a bottom-up approach, but eventually we'll need to reach the boundaries and limits of our pure reason and pure understanding. Kant does this through dialectics. So in section 40 through 44, Kant goes in and develops a dialectical method that is very different from Plato. The way Plato does it is almost in a conversational method. Arguments and counter-arguments lead to clearing up of the answer. For example, in the Symposium, when speaking of love, they spoke, for example, how love was virtuous and kind. But in order to get closer to the truth, they had to speak of love, how it can be infectious and all-encompassing and overtaking, and almost negative in a sense. Due to this, they were able to get closer to a clearing up of what the truth of what it really is. For Kant, it's not just for clearing up an idea, but rather showing us what happens when we completely reach the limits of pure human reason. Through various theses and antitheses of important concepts, we will see 3 that he looks at. We will find that the synthesis is almost unobtainable. It is at a limit of our human reason. The 3 ideas that Kant decides to carry this out with are what he deems the psychological ideas, the cosmological ideas, and the theological idea. Section 45. So here Kant goes into his dialectic of pure reason, and it begins with the psychological ideas, which speaks on Descartes' philosophy. René Descartes, famous for his argument cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am, refutes the idea that we could be trapped within a false illusion of existence. For Descartes, doubting that we exist proves that we can exist as a thinking being. So even if we are dreaming, we must exist. Quote, Descartes does nothing but distinguish external experience from dreaming and the conformity to law. So essentially for Kant, he does not go far enough. If space and time are presupposed as conditions for existence, then our experience cannot actually prove the actuality of these objects outside of us. We may be a thinking subject, but since our thought depends on space and time, which allows us to intuit the world, we do not know if what outside us is. Essentially, we hit limits when trying to find the unconditioned or most simple subjects of experience. Section 45. The cosmological ideas. In this section, we see 4 transcendental ideas, which refer to the absolute completeness of the series of the conditions for a given conditioned. So in this, he lays down 4 theses, 4 antitheses, and then we see that the synthesis of all of these sort of makes us hit a contradictory barrier. So 2 of these specifically, the second and the fourth, are almost just direct responses to Leibniz's philosophy. So in 1, he says, the world has, as to time and space, a beginning, or a limit. But the antithesis is, the world is, as to time and space, infinite. For the second, it's that everything is constituted out of the simple, and then for the antithesis, it's that there is nothing simple, but everything is complete. Third, there are in the world causes through freedom, and the antithesis being, there is no freedom, but all is nature. And lastly, in the series of world causes, there is some necessary being. And then the antithesis, of course, being, there is nothing necessary in the world, but in this series, all is contingent. So all of these statements are contradictory to the world of sense. That is because he will always hit a limit. There are no positives, there are no negatives that can overtake the other side completely. And this is because our pure understanding will never be able to let us cognize things that are high on this level of this because they transcend experience. Before I go into section 46, in the conclusion, I just want to state that the theological idea is essentially Kant saying that we will never be able to cognize a supreme being or God by means of pure human understanding. We'll always hit barriers, for example, trying to cognize what an all-powerful being would be that is beyond human experience. Anyway, going into section 46, we see that overall, in the conclusion, we can kind of wrap up how metaphysics in general is possible. And this is just from ascending from the data of its actual use, at least in its consequences, to the ground of possibility. Kind of like what we were talking before, taking a bottom-up approach at doing an analysis. This all pretty much covers the Prolegomena. He continues on in the appendix to speak in a much more aggressive or assertive tone as to how frustrating it is that people fail to grasp what metaphysics really is, but it is essentially just an argumentative summary of what we have covered prior. I hope to make more lectures or explanations to go with various thinkers and texts in the very near future. This did take a lot of time to format and record, but I've definitely learned from various mistakes, and I can see that it'll be a lot more fluid in the future. Thank you.